Thanks everybody for coming. This is going to be kind of a quick overview of Ignition plus some kind of hands-on code going through the stuff.
My eyes are
I just want to make sure I got the fan here. So for anybody that's not familiar, Ignition is a development and site core framework that I've been working on for the last couple of years, but we've completely revamped it recently. And since I've been with Proficient now, we've made quite a few advancements to it, and it's actually going to be a project that we're releasing open source or doing a beta release of it as of this Friday. And what this is going to end up being is a platform not only to make development more consistent and more rapid, but it's going to hopefully allow people to jump site to site or project to project a lot easier. MSO projects that are all running on the same platform should be a lot easier to maintain, and there should be a lot of benefits, and we're kind of using it as a platform that other modules and things can be broken into. So I'm going to kind of go quickly. We only have about an hour and a half, and I want to leave time for questions and some practical side of it too. So I'm going to kind of go through this stuff pretty quickly. A lot of you have used this before, but not everybody has. And some of you have at least gotten my spiel before. But anyhow, the core of Ignition really is based around two areas. And one is going to be the site core side of things, and one is going to be then the code side of things or the solution side of things. So I'll start with the templates. And basically, these are the core templates that are associated with the Ignition framework. We've got a base item, which everything eventually inherits. We've got an item for workflow and rendering parameters. And then we've got some other kind of supporting classes or templates, things that you'll see like the site container and stuff like that. Most of it really comes down to these fields. This is what you're going to use in your day-to-day stuff. So I'm going to kind of focus less on how the architecture works and more on how you actually were to be using this for development. What?
I'm just trying to make that bigger. Nothing works.
So you could close the talk for chat frame and content view.
I am in content. I thought I was in content.
Yeah, the chat frame should make it a little bigger.
There you go.
All right, well, you're only seeing half the screen. It doesn't help that I'm on a high-res monitor.
Yeah, it really messes everything up.
Okay. Well, apologies if it's hard to read. If anybody needs me to zoom in on something,
What's that?
I'll try to zoom in a little bit. There, I zoomed in a little bit. That should hopefully be helpful. But anyhow, so the fields are based around inheritance, or all of the templates are. So it's to start off with, we've got our general content type templates, which are going to be reused here. So these should kind of cover the vast majority of things that you're likely to encounter. Like an abstract, background images, alternate background images, like if you have a mobile versus a desktop image, rich content areas, plain text, single line text. Then you've got a couple of headings, and these, we can expand on these as well, but this is kind of the base starting point. We've got links and email links, and then we've got some settings types, which I'll go more into. These are what we're going to base our content off of for more of the marketing content rich type pages. So this wouldn't be necessarily what you would use for a product listing page or something like that. This would be what you're going to use for your About Us page, your general kind of marketing stuff that the marketers are going to go in and do testing and personalization and all that kind of stuff. This is really heavily driven around making those content-heavy pages very rapid to develop. We do have some settings and such that we use as well. Just a variation of different things. String settings, which stores a string value. Options, which we use both as tags and as drop-downs, like for populating drop-down options. key value pairs, ints, those kind of things. The general things that you're likely to need to just reference as a setting. And I'll show you how those work or how we use those in a little bit. And then there's pages. So for these content type pages, generally we're only going to have one template that we use for page, or in the case, what we'll probably do is inherit, like for this demo that somehow now I don't have, I don't know where the stuff went. Or no, it's not in sites, that's why. So for this demo site, I have an ignition page, because this is for building the ignition demo here. So this would be the main page that we use for all this content, and all it is it's just straight up inheriting this main page. You'll also notice the page doesn't have any fields. So the whole premise behind this type of framework for the content type pages is that content and pages are two completely separate things. What you actually present on a page is completely separate from the page itself. If we actually look at what page inherits, then page inherits and only has these templates that relate to a page. So metadata, SEO type things, navigation, taxonomy, workflow. These are going to be the only things that a page has. So you're not going to be looking at a page and finding content associated with it anywhere. The content is going to come from other controls. So that's it for templates pretty much as far as what we do. I mean, we can, in the fields, these you'll kind of get used to using, but for the most part, we're either going to use these exactly, or we're going to use like add on to these and just kind of expand them as we need to. But the big thing is when we're focusing on using the experience editor, we don't really care what these fields are called so much as the fact that in the experience editor, you're editing it in line. So it's the WYSIWYG setup. You're not going to see these field names, so it really doesn't matter to the content editor what those fields are actually called. And we do put some additional information when you're in editing mode that says, hey, this is what the field actually maps back to, but it's really just kind of in case people work between the modes. Our big push is going to have people working in the experience editor. So next, then, as far as that goes, we have branch templates, which currently I think I've only got one set up for a home page. And if you haven't worked with branch templates before, what branch templates will allow you to do is to create one or more nodes that are created all at once and at the same time, where you have a main item and then you can have items that are child items of that. So this could be, we could have 20 items deep if we really wanted to. The other thing is that you can take a regular template. So this looks as if it's a different template than the home page or than the regular page. But if you look here, it's just a page. So in a branch template, I can override things like the icon or insert options or any of the standard values for a page. I can override here, and it only affects pages that are created using this branch template. So you can that way in code, any number of different pages that we use are just page. You don't have to fiddle around with.
Yeah, so this would be your recommended approach versus creating separate templates for different
Correct.
Pages, right? So everything's a branch template.
Yes. So effectively, you'll have two kinds of pages, really. You're going to have these content pages, and then you're going to have data that is also a page. And that's going to be where you're going to have like blog posts, product detail pages, news articles, those kind of things will be content that has presentation. So those pages only exist to be those things. But these pages, these content pages, exist just to be content. They exist for people to put in content or arrange them however they need to. So a common scenario, because really the only difference between how these pages are going to work is this home page might have a single column layout, and an about page might have a 2-column left, and it might have some fixed things that are on every single one of these about pages or something like that. And so you're basically just pre-populating some additional presentation details onto those pages. Or you might say, I've got a main page, and I can only add subpages underneath the main page, so you can override the insert options using a branch template. And then, so you're not ever changing the base page template itself. You're only making changes to things that are created as an instance of this branch. A couple of caveats as far as this goes. If you make changes to a branch, it is not going to change items that have already been created using it. What it does do is if you create the item from a branch, it does say, hey, I was created using this branch. That's a property on the item itself. So if you need to find all of them that were created with a certain branch, you can do so.
That's something like you could use like the PowerShell.
Oh, exactly.
To go through and automatically edit stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if you need to, say, copy some sort of standard presentation across a bunch of things, it's really easy just to find the branch field and just update this other value based on that. And we'll have utilities as part of the Ignition framework that will do those kind of things as well. So we'll get into a little bit of that, but that's not as much the focus for this call. So that's kind of, this is where all of our templates and everything come from. They're either content-based things that are just pure templates that'll hold content. For example, I'll show some that I'm using for this site. Like a slide, for example. Oh, so I guess I should show how this works. So a slide is like a slide for a carousel, or it could be an accordion, or anything that would take like multiple pages of content. So this one is in particular is for a carousel. There's no fields on this, but the content we inherit heading. This should be highlighting. Okay, heading, rich content 1, Boolean, which is just like a checkbox, and a background image. And the reason that we do this will become apparent when we start looking at the code, but effectively this allows us to treat, we can interchange different types of content with each other, because we can just say, okay, all we need is to get items that have a heading and a background image. So because this is a heading, or inherits from heading and inherits from background image, I can treat all of these items, whether they're slides, whether they're call to actions, which probably also have a heading and a background image. They do have a heading and a background image here. So I can interchange, for certain renderings, I can interchange call to actions and slides and reuse them in different scenarios. So the whole bonus to this, in addition to how quickly you can develop things, because you don't have to create all these fields, you're just inheriting existing fields. The models are already mapped for all of these things, so it's a bunch of less work as far as that goes. But you can interchange these things in a really dynamic and flexible way. Proficient.com, for example, we do quite a bit of that, where content is designed to be like a slide or a hero or something like that, but we're using it as something else in a different place. And this is what allows us to really do that. So you'll see this kind of stuff over and over, where you're just inheriting from the base fields that I showed in the very beginning, in the base templates here. And these exist under Ignition and fields. So you can see here, like heading, subtitle, we have heading and subtitle here. So that's basically how the templates and everything work. As far as renderings then, we are using MVC, as most everybody knows by now. So we're using all controller renderings. Very rarely will there be an excuse to use a view rendering, especially with how easy we make it to create controller renderings. And all a controller rendering, for anybody that hasn't had a chance to work with MVC, is it's going to be like a sub layout, except it uses an MVC controller to start the process. It's the MVC equivalent of a sub layout.
So those that haven't worked with MVC, a view rendering has no controller code. So it automatically uses the get model pipeline to populate the view model for your view. So in some ways it's a little easier, but once you show the code, you'll...
Yeah, we've gone to pretty great lengths to make it just as easy to use controller renderings. So effectively, you can use Sitecore kind of as an MVVM or an MVC way. Using Sitecore purely as MVC is kind of using Sitecore as the controller, and you use view renderings. you lose a lot of flexibility and you lose a lot of testability by doing that. It's really hard to do unit testing on view renderings like at all. You really can't. You can use coded UI tests or something like that, but it's not as good. With controller renderings, then we can use unit testing. It's a lot easier to reuse these components. And overall, it promotes better coding practices, which is the other big thing that we're really pushing for with this stuff, is better coding practices. So a couple of things with it. So now in code, you can see here, and this is really all there is to setting up a controller rendering. I know that my controller is called call to action controller. So all I need to put in here is call to action, because MVC knows you don't have to say controller, you can just say call to action. And this is my action, which is called floating. So if I jump here into code and go to my call to action controller, you can see this is my call to action controller and the floating method. And then this is what gets you into the rest of it, but I'm not quite there yet. So that's what corresponds to this. And then the only other thing you would do would be equivalent to working with anything else. So if you're using a parameters template, and it's catching up, so there you would set your parameters template in here like you might already do. Because I'm using a parameters template, I always set it to open properties after add. And then for those of you that haven't done any coding or very little coding against the experience editor, this is a big deal. So the data source location and the data source template. What the data source location does is, first of all, when you create a new item or add a rendering to a page in the Sitecore in the experience editor, it's going to say, where do I look for this item? And what we're using with the assets, if you'll notice when we were looking at that branch template, so the home page has this local assets folder. It's actually, for simplicity, its name is just assets, but local assets is a display name that makes it a little clearer for content authors what's going on. It's not really a big deal, but it can be kind of helpful so they can see more clearly what's going on. So back to this then. Our data source location says we're going to look, and the ./ it's just XPath that says look at the folder underneath this called assets. So wherever you are in the tree, it's going to look in that assets folder. So something else that you can do with this data source location, say you had local content, but you also had global content. So what I can do is I can pipe separate these, and I could say put in the GUID of the ID of the folder that would have my global content, or an XPath or any sort of query, anything like that. In this case, most of these things tend to be local, so I'm not doing it as global for that. And then you set the template. So if the item existed, and then all you would do when you add the component, it's going to say, hey, what do you want me to choose as a data source? You'd pick that component, and everything is great. What setting the data source template says is it's going to restrict which templates you can choose as your data source, and it's also going to say, if I want to create one, what type do I create? Now this, you can only choose one type as your data source template, but if other things inherit from it and they already exist, you can choose other things too. Not always necessarily the best thing, but it is just an option you have. So in this case, I know that my model is going to be a call to action, and so that's the template that I'm referencing. Boom, boom, done. And then another advantage, and this is something that this one you can't exactly do using the compatible renderings. Although I take that back. You can use the compatible renderings for a lot of this, as long as your fields are there. But this says this compatible renderings means that a content author can switch this out. Say they don't like the way the floating call to action looks, they can look here and swap it out for the main call to action. And the data source stays the same, but the presentation changes. So this is just purely at design time. This isn't testing, but the same principle works with testing. So your A/B testing or personalization, things like that. But this allows them to say, okay, wait, let me just look at the page or choose this different thing and see how this works, but without changing the data that backs it up. And then last but not least, you'll have experience editor buttons. These would be things where if you wanted to add an item below the item that you've that the data source item is. So say my data source item was an accordion, I might add accordion slides using the insert button here, and then they would create children underneath my accordion item, and it goes based off of your insert options. So if my insert options say that an accordion item can have a slide below it, then that would be what I would be able to allow or be able to add using insert here. And then move up or move down, this is actually moving the rendering itself around. So you'll only use this in some cases, but they're handy when you do need to. So this is what you would use to allow it to add children. Any questions or anything so far? Like I said, I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. Going once, going twice. Okay, so that is in effect the main part of how renderings work. The only other interesting thing or kind of novel thing that we do with renderings is we build our pages, especially, I mean, we build any page using what I've called frames, which are basically kind of scaffolding. So let's not save that. So the frames are kind of scaffolding. And what they'll do is they'll provide some HTML structure and then more placeholders. And I have kind of a naming schema that I use as we're kind of working from the raw, like basic beginning all the way up through content things. So they start out with layout and then a descriptive name. And then as you move up, it becomes content with a descriptive name. And once you're beyond the content level, say I have a component that allows me, that has another placeholder to put a bunch of call to actions in, like a grid component or something that I can put a bunch of components into. What you'll do is you'll make that one grid main or something like that, so that it's always very clear the context that you're using that placeholder in, and then a descriptive name for it. And I'll show you that in code, but that's not as critical, just kind of an aside there. So you'll find lots and lots of nested placeholders. The other thing is that dynamic placeholders are built into the framework. So you can use, in a lot of cases, if you would add a component that has more placeholders underneath it, it would cause problems because you can only have one instance of a placeholder key on a page. The dynamic placeholder will actually append the GUID of the rendering itself onto the end of the name for the placeholder. So they're all going to be unique then. And it does that, it should do it seamlessly so it doesn't even show up to the content editor, but that sometimes is the case and sometimes it's not. So that's the two things. You got one layout, then in the ignition framework itself, this ignition frame is always there. And then there might be, like I've got this row, this particular demo site is a responsive site. So I've set it up so that the row, and if we look at our placeholder settings, you can actually kind of see the structure. So I've got the layout content, layout experience editor, header, footer, all these things. So these are all just purely the outer layer, the layout. And then within head, so I know this is relating to the head component, I've got additional placeholders here that are all named head and then their thing. Content, I've got content main and content row. So the layout content has an allowed control, or should have an allowed control. No, it's got carousel. Okay, so this one has this content row, where the layout, that's right, that's the layout. Content. Either way, this site itself is still a work in progress. We're frantically trying to get this stuff done. but the content row then can have these other things added to it. So the placeholder settings are your insert options for the page editor. What's the time? So it's 4 p.m. now. Okay, so moving on then to content. So this is an example page. You can see like it's got the metadata field, which would be your page title that's going to appear in metadata, your page description, which should appear in metadata, any additional body classes, which I don't have all that stuff set up yet, but just stuff that would be tied to a page. Your navigation, what name appears in menus that this thing appears in, or do I want to hide this from navigation, or do I want to hide the children from navigation? SEO type stuff, if I want to override a canonical URL. Taxonomy, let me add tags or specific tags to the page for searching and filtering and that kind of thing. But notice none of this is about content. But then we go to the local assets folder and we see that I've got slides, and I haven't populated a bunch of stuff in here because I've just been using this for development so far. But you'd have content. If I look at this call to action, I've got this as a heading, and my rich content should have some lorem or some bacon ipsum in there. I can put up a link to somewhere, and then, so all of my content comes in the form of these modules, and they're kind of self-contained. So the renderings associate themselves with one of these contents as pieces of content as a data source, and this is where our content comes from. So this allows us to reuse things all over, like I said, to reuse things in different ways, and generally be as kind of as flexible as we need to with these. The other then, usually we'll have a site settings, and or a shared folder for content, and that would just be where we might have a shared folder for call to actions, or a shared folder for heroes, or different marketing type stuff that are shared resources that are used over and over. I want to jump to the code a little bit, and I'm actually going to walk through creating a component with everyone. I don't have the site fully working in Experience Editor right now. Just ran out of time before the call. You can see, like, I've got the header rendering, I've got a footer rendering, and this is the content. It's copied and pasted it in here, so it's not, didn't strip out the tags. But this particular content is in here. It's just not all integrated with the front end code yet. And you can see that is actually the same text here that's in this floating content. So jumping to the code, not going to go extremely in depth about the architecture of the solution other than kind of where things live. This solution is going to support both TDS and Unicorn. Currently, TDS is what's up and working. They pushed changes to Unicorn, but it hasn't been merged in yet, so.
I don't know who you're talking about.
How are you going to get those? Don't they conflict with each other?
No, it'll be fine. So the solution, we've got the TDS solutions up here. And every site, whether it's a single site or a multi-tenant site, is going to have at least 2 website projects. And then, so there'll be a TDS project for every website project. So Ignition Root is where, this is our cross-cutting area, our cross-cutting concerns, or our composition root. This is where all that stuff gets wired up. So we have and this is a web project. So ignitionroot.tds.master is the project that deploys that and has any of the Ignition TDS items. So it's just going to have some base Ignition templates in here. Then, since the other thing that we're shipping with this is a demo site, it's going to have all the rest of the stuff under ignition.sc.tds.master. So this would be when we sync, would have the home page or all that other stuff, your layouts, and all of those things would be part of this. So then core, ignition.core, is actually where this is the the lifeblood of the solution. So in here is where all the code that does all of the automatic model binding and all of these other doodads and whiz-bangs and gadgets, all the magic kind of happens in here. So you probably won't need to do any work in here, or more than likely won't, but just so you know kind of where things are coming from, the core project is where all that stuff is. It's where you're going to find your main base things that you are going to use all the time, which is going to be the agent, the controller, the view model, and the simple agent. But the rest of this stuff you're not really going to need to worry about. The models, you will use some of the models. I'll kind of go over these briefly. So model base is just enough to allow, we use glass for anybody that isn't familiar. So this is just enough backing code to support an item. So this is the minimum that glass needs to be able to give you the right item from Sitecore. And then there's a iModel base with metadata. So you only have to choose the items or the interfaces that you actually are going to use. So this allows you to remove a lot of unnecessary stuff. But model base itself, we are using interfaces for our models for everything except for search and rendering parameters. Both of those, we have concrete models, and that's where I have this model base and params base for those. But then we do have the containers, content folders, nav folders, option folders. The different page types, these are the things that the page inherits from. Navigation, metadata, all of that. Settings, we've got all the decimal settings. Everything you see as a template in Sitecore is also a model here. And then there's a couple of system ones like a bucket for a bucket folder, dictionary entries, files, folders, media items, all of that here. But these are just the core ones. Now we go into ignition.data, and this is where the actual fields themselves live. So if that background image that we looked at before, here is the glass code for the model for a background image. And this is still an interface. So the beautiful thing is Sitecore does multiple inheritance. Because these are interfaces, we can do multiple inheritance with our models. So you don't have to define these things. They're part of the framework. Glass will already know how to deal with these. And so we've got all of these types and everything in here. And then we'll kind of skip infrastructure for now. Infrastructure isn't of importance to us right now, but it would be where you would have any sort of Sitecore events or pipelines, things like that would end up going into the infrastructure project here. And then the presentation folder is where you're actually going to be doing your work. I mean, 80, 90% of your work is going to be done in here. Now, one thing that Corey has helped implement and a decision that we've made to go along this route is that we both are pretty much the whole Ignition team, or the majority of the Ignition team at the time, kind of agreed that the MVC approach to the way they put folders together is really inefficient and it's really a pain in the butt. Trying to jump from one massive folder of views and one massive folder of controllers and another massive folder of view models and all that, it's just a mess. So we go against the components model. So each project could have its own component, will have its own components folder. And then within there, like here's, for example, everything related to a call to action. So you've got your controller in this project, or in this folder. You've got your view model, and I think I had an alternate version of it. You've got your views and an Experience Explorer version of these views. So we have a separate view for the Experience Explorer. And these things are automatically called. You don't have to do any special logic. So here's the glass view, or the view for this. And the floating view model, you can see it has some additional, this is what I was talking about some additional information. We can actually give additional guidance to our content authors here, and then we can. And I didn't go ahead and make all this editable yet, but we can do all the editable stuff in here that we would need to for Glass, as opposed to this being, you don't have to worry about any of the extra markup for the experience editor. It just renders what you need, and that's it. So starting back then with the controller, I know I'm jumping around a bit, but there's kind of everything's interconnected. So, so our controllers, you'll notice if you've worked with MVC before, you're probably used to seeing a lot of code in your controllers. I don't like that, and we found that it's really useful to make your controllers as small as possible. So all of our controllers inherit from a base controller, which I'm not going to really go into the underlying workings of that on this call, but it provides a bunch of extra functionality. It also provides, we're using dependency injection, and we're using IOC. We're supporting both Castle Windsor and Simple Injector, not at the same time, but we have a branch for each. So we have this context, which has got all the stuff. I'll show briefly about this. A lot of you have seen it. It's going to give you some standard stuff, the home item, the context page that your current request is relating to, your data source item, your rendering parameter. All of this gets populated for you. You don't have to do any of that. The framework itself populates everything here for you, including we have some stuff for getting the right language versions, getting the items and making sure you can set a context language and just use this item instead of having to specify a language all the time or that kind of thing. So like your Sitecore context or your Sitecore service, this context is a Sitecore context and a Sitecore service. So anything you would need to do using like a get item or anything like that, this item context will be passed along all the way down the line automatically for you, so you have access to it at every step of the way. So your controller, each one will have a constructor, but generally it's this. You're not going to need to do very much in the constructor unless you need to initialize something from outside of Sitecore. That's all you need for your constructor. It's just implement the base, or pass along the context to the base, and that's it. Your actions, very simple. Normally you would have to return like a view or a model or something like that, and MVC would do a lot of the wire up for that to get you the right view. What we do, since there's some extra complexity here, is in the base controller, I've created this get view result method, or there's this get view result with params. If you're using a rendering parameters, which in this case I am, you would need to call this. But otherwise, you call get view results, and it creates everything along the way for you. The next step along the way is going to be the action, or is going to be the agent. So this would actually instantiate the agent. It's going to instantiate your view model. It's also going to automatically do model binding between your data source and your view model for any of these fields that we support. How is my battery running low? Oh, that's his battery's running low. Oops. One moment while we get Scott's computer plugged in.
It's all right. I'm not important. Keep going.
All right. So, yeah, the effectively get view results, there'd be a couple of ways to call it. We have what's a simple agent, which is effectively makes these, it's an implied simple agent, which is what I was showing up here. But effectively, it's what allows you to just not do, if you know you're not going to do any code in your agents and all you're going to be doing is displaying content exactly as it is in Sitecore, then you can just call this with your view model type. The framework does all the rest of it. You get your binding, and everything is kosher. If you actually need to do code in an agent, and I think in one of these other ones I do. So this one, I'm specifically setting a home item and putting it into the model. Or there might be cases where you need to get the child items of the current item and do some operations on that, or call a web service and get information, or any number of different things. That's what an agent is for. And the role of the agent is to act as like a view model factory. Because effectively you've got your controller is your switchboard. It says where does all this stuff go, and it routes everything there. Your agent then does everything that's needed to pass the data to the view. And then you've got the view then, which will display the data. So anything that doesn't get automatically bound, you would need to wire up in an agent. But like I said, in a lot of cases, as you can see, like for the call to actions, we don't need them at all. So most times you can just call it with your view model, and it's the same thing then as using a view rendering, except that we have the flexibility to unit test this stuff, and it's once again a better coding practice.
And reuse the agents.
And reuse them, yeah, exactly. So by using these agents, if you, for example, on this controller, this one is using the same agent 3 different times. So this is for the header, the footer, and the footer script. So the view model is the same for all these. So the view models kind of have a one-to-one relationship with your agent. The agent then will populate these view models, and instead of having to create new code for each one of these or duplicating a lot of code, just use this agent once in all 3 of them, and then some wizardry that Corey had put together. The views will automatically get resolved based on the name of the action method. So this knows, because this is header, it's going to automatically know to use header.cshtml. Because this one is footer, it's going to know to use footer.cshtml. So you don't have to pass in, like with the proficient site even, some of the people on the call that worked on the proficient site, when we were doing this, we had to pass in a string that was like, okay, what's the view path? We don't need to do that anymore. This is even easier than it was then. So these renderings would all be, they're all using the same view model, but they're doing different things based on the context. Because the view is different, it's looking at different parts of that view model for what it's going to render. And now in this case, this is header, footer, and some script stuff. Not really important because the header and the footer, they're going to use things from the page probably, like page title and that kind of stuff. But moving right along, so that's basically what an agent does. And then your view models, once again, simple, simple, simple. They can get a little more complicated, so I'm going to show close all documents. We'll go back to one of these call to actions. So this is where even more wizardry happens. So here you add these types, the heading in Sitecore, the heading, the subtitle, the rich content, a primary link, a background image. Those are all templates in Sitecore. And if we look here, so this is actually the model. So if we go into Sitecore and I look at the call to action template, we can see here that this is inheriting heading, subtitle, background image, logo, which is a special type of image, although I think I'm not using that right now, rich content, and a primary link. And there is absolutely no content other than that in this template. But it has that inheritance. We jump back to code here, and you can see that iCall to action implements iHeading, iSubtitle, iBackground image, iImage, iRich content, iPrimary link, and that's it. And you'd have your template ID in here to point to this. So this is all your model is going to look like. You don't have to do any more with this whatsoever. As a matter of fact, once that model is created, you can close it and never use it again. Because Glass needs that model to exist so that it knows when it comes across the template with that ID, which templates to associate with it. But once it's there, it's done. You don't ever have to use it again. And we're working on making it so that you never even have to create that one. That's on our short list of things to get done.
So if I needed to make a service call to populate part of the view model, I would add that to the model.
Yeah, well, you would add it to the view model, not to the model.
Okay.
Yeah, your view model is what's going to end up getting passed to the view. The model is just a DTO from Sitecore.
Or Glass.
Right.
So I would add it here.
Yeah, you would add it to your view model itself.
A service call to what? To Sitecore or like something?
Well, no, like to external service.
Oh, well, then you do that in your agent.
Well,
the results of it, yeah.
The results of the web service.
Yeah, your agent would be where you would do the work. You shouldn't have any actual code. This should all be just data in your view model. So the agent would do the calling, but you would store the results of your call
as part of
in your view model.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of another thing. Your view model should only be data. And it should be, I mean, you can reuse these things, so it's not like this needs to map. If there's things you don't use in a particular view, it's not a big deal. Oh, that's me. I'm probably
not sure what that is. Is that you? Or
that was me. That was another meeting thing popping up. So yeah, your view models are just the data that your views are going to consume. And yeah, so the magic here then is because this is an I heading, and Glass we've already declared the I heading module. The auto binding will go through, and this is one of the magic things in the controller, is it says this data item that I'm getting from Sitecore has a heading field in it. So I see also that your view model has a heading field. I'm going to copy that value over for you. But what it actually does is, because of how inheritance works, is this is actually every single one of these is your data source. It's your data source cast as an I heading. It's your data source cast as an I subtitle. Or it's your data source cast as an I rich content. Because Glass actually needs to have a reference to an item, a Sitecore item, in order to do all the page editor stuff. This is what allows it to do so. So it doesn't actually assign like a specific field to each of these things. It actually puts that item, a reference to that item. So even though you could have 100 fields here that were all just Sitecore data fields, it's still only one data item, so it's not repeating everything over and over. It's just references using a filter of this is an I heading, which we know that an I heading then just has a heading field. A subtitle just has a subtitle field, etc. So Glass knows how to deal with these with the experience editor. The framework automatically binds all this. And one of our big driving things was pretty much, we want you guys to have to do as little work as possible. And we want to do as little work as possible. So we're doing all this work up front to reduce errors, to make all this stuff really rapid. And I'm going to get into, hopefully time permitting, get into actually walking through end-to-end doing one of these. So then finally you get to your view, and we'll look at, say this. And then at this point, it's your standard view, or your standard MVC view. So it's razor syntax. We don't put any code like other than looping or things like that. You shouldn't be putting logic in your views. It should purely be presentation. If you're doing any sort of decisions, then you should probably be doing that stuff in the agent, making your decision logic and then overriding which view you're going to use, or you're going to do it from within Sitecore and make two different renderings and say this is the one that is 2-column left, or like a left-oriented version of this versus a right-oriented version, or with a background image, without a background image. You just create two renderings.
Can you show an example of a view here that has rendering parameters? Do you have that?
This one actually does.
Okay. Oh, right there, yeah.
Yeah. So this automatically, the rendering parameters automatically gets bound here. So they're cast as a params, or it's an object. Just cast it as your type, and then whatever your fields. So that's exactly what this line is. This one in particular, it uses a CSS class to determine which icon to display. So that's the type of thing you would put in a rendering parameter. You should only be changing like tweaks with rendering parameters, not major changes. So yeah, and then this stuff comes from the model, etc. And here's rendering a link, and if you need to put a class on the link, there's these glass extensions, which allows you to get like the one for a CSS class, the one for an image, or adding attributes to the item. It's just helper classes that will do that for you for the parameters for glass. So I'm going to pause for just a moment. Any questions thus far? And I'm right after this, I'm going to go into, we're going to just create a component beginning to end right now. So any questions before we jump into that?
Sure. Hey, this is Carlos. One quick question, or one or two actually. And it's cool that, with this new setup, you don't need separate folders for controllers, views, and things of that nature. But let's say you do like using the folders because it helps you organize those set of files. Is that okay with the way it's currently constructed, or would that be a problem for finding, for instance, the view from the controller?
You cannot put folders underneath here and have it work. But the idea is...
No, you can.
Oh, you can?
You can put folders under there and like have a controllers folder and an agents folder or whatever. It's just your views can't be under a folder.
So yeah, the views are the only thing that matters. But generally, you're only going to, matter of fact, not generally, full stop, you're only going to have one controller per component, period. You will have an agent per view model.
Right.
And then you might have the same view model, or you might have multiple view models depending on what's going on. And in defining this, like a component would be, if you have a product component, you might have a product overview, or like view and rendering in Sitecore. You might have a product detail view or a product listing. Those would all be grouped under components because they're all related, very strongly related to the same kind of data type. And
so you can have a folder, you can have like another level of folders under like ignition.
As long as all of your views are at the top level, yes. The views, because of how how Corey did the view resolver.
So if it's like you have 100,
you shouldn't have 100. Well, I mean, you can have as many
right
components as you need. You can have as many folders for components as you needed. So like this, we could have 50 components, but within each component,
but I can't group those.
Inside, well, you can't group the components, no. But generally, what you're going to do here is your sites. Probably, I mean, you could have multiple sites. I guess, could we do multiple folders of components? Almost like an area for the components?
I think if you're going to do that, you just need to use areas.
Probably, yeah. And we do support MVC areas as well.
I just know for the current one I'm working on, like, it would be like this long.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you can break those into multiple website projects too, and then just kind of organize them a little differently because they will overlap, but it should only support like one main folder per site. That may change in the future, but currently,
yeah, in this case, it wouldn't make
now.
Sense to put it in different sites.
Yeah, but I mean, even then, like you might have 50 different renderings, but that might only correspond to 10 different components because you might have some that are related or some aren't. But think about this: even if you did have 50 components, when you're working on the call to action, everything related to call to actions in one place, as opposed to with MVC, you'd have your views folder and the huge list of views, and you'd have to find that view or whichever views you're working on, and your models and your controller and view model, all that stuff. Whereas here, even if you had a long list, it's alphabetical, and everything related to those are in one folder. Okay, so yeah, any other questions before we move on?
Sure. Did you mention earlier that when it came to providing a dynamic placeholder for those components where the placeholder has to be reused, you were using the rendering ID?
It's part of the dynamic placeholder thing that we're using. So, for example, I've got this row component, and I just changed this because the page editor wasn't working. But this is all you have to do. Is you put a dynamic placeholder, instead of using placeholder here like you would with regular Sitecore placeholder, you do a dynamic placeholder, We have constants for everything, so that all of our strings, we're not passing around magic strings and stuff like that. But
Okay.
that's it.
But it would add a rendering behind the scenes. It would add a rendering ID to the placeholder name.
Right. So this placeholder name actually translates to content main. But when you add this row to a page, the placeholder that it actually exposes is going to be content main underscore and then a GUID.
Okay. And the only reason I'm asking is because that means that from an experience editor situation, assuming, well, because it's being dynamically generated in that fashion, so we wouldn't have a placeholder setting item for it, that from the
Actually, there is a placeholder setting item for it. It's going to use the rendering as if it were content main, but it's going to differentiate them based on the, sorry, my fan is being absconded with.
Air on the backside.
It's going to append that, but it's still going to use the settings. So any of your placeholder, your insert options, things like that go along with this content main placeholder that you define in Sitecore are applied to any instance of this.
Okay.
And it should be stripping that GUID off before it actually displays it in the experience editor as well. So this is purely behind the scenes, and you don't have to do anything for it.
Oh, cool. So it will strip it out so that
placeholder.
Okay. So it will strip it out so you can reuse the placeholder setting item no matter how many times you use this component. Cool.
Exactly. I mean, that's the whole point of doing this is because, say, this row, you might have, because this effectively is a responsive layout row in the Bootstrap, you could have 3 different rows in here. They all expose a placeholder, but because they're doing this dynamic placeholder, then you're not going to get collisions with your placeholder names.
Right, right.
So yeah, that is fully supported and part of the framework out of the box.
Okay. Is that code in the dynamic placeholder function so that if I want to take a look and see how it's doing that, I can?
Yes, it's up here in the ignition.core under like helpers or extensions, or here it is here under HTML helpers, the dynamic placeholder, and there's a couple of supporting files with it. Okay. And I think these have the citation of where they came from as well.
Right.
So any other questions before I jump into actually building something? Okay, so we'll start in Sitecore, and I know that there was a component here that was like a profile. It was like a profile image, like Joe Schmo is a developer or whatever, in the design that I was using. So first I'm going to create an item for it, and then I'm going to insert a new template, and we'll call this profile. It's going to inherit from, you could technically say none at first because we're going to inherit from other things, and then save it here. Now, I know that the profile is going to need a heading. It'll have a subtitle. It's going to have a background image. We might have an actual image for like a headshot or something. And it's going to have a rich content bio. And maybe a link to their blog, and maybe an email link. So I'm not going to model all these in the code just because, well, I mean, I guess I could, but.
So the reason you have multiple rich content, like I saw you had rich content 1.
Is in case you need to have, like, there may be a scenario where you need more than one, absolutely. Okay. Like you may have a 2-column content thing that you need to use for some reason 2 separate things, or an abstract is also a rich text field. It's where you might have an article's abstract, but then you can show more or different sections around images. It's just for flexibility. Unlike what was used, I don't remember if it was that way. I think it was that way maybe in Itron. I don't remember if it was right in the proficient.com. But each one of these background, rich content 1, rich content 2, and rich content 3 are individual fields. It's not like in some projects earlier, it was rich content 2 had a rich content 1 and a rich content 2. It's not like that anymore. It's rich content 1 is rich content 1, rich content 2 is rich content 2, and that's it. Same with rich content 3.
And maybe potential in the future to need that for images if you need like an image in the
I have an image and an image 2 and things like that.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the nice thing about this too is for a particular installation, if you need an additional field, throw it in there.
Yeah.
I mean, if it makes sense, nothing is saying you can't extend on this. This is a starter kit.
Okay, that's what's going to be one part of my question. Like, would you encourage us to create our own fields? Like, I know I did that with Proficient.com for an office address, just because in my mind it made sense to create another set of fields for that.
Yeah, and something like an address is something that I should be adding to the framework anyways. But yeah, absolutely. What I would suggest is for those things, like put it into your site folder instead, and then just have like a fields. That way you're not mixing it in with the core framework itself. But other than that, yeah, absolutely. Create what you need. Whatever is appropriate or whatever like your lead or whatever is for the project says is appropriate, do it. So I've created my item here. I'm going to save it. Now, just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to go here and I'm going to create my profile rendering. Or first the folder, and then I'm going to insert a rendering. And it's going to be a controller rendering. Call it profile. And I know that my controller, I haven't created it yet, but my controller is going to be profile controller. And my action will probably be profile as well. And I'll just need to remember when I create my component or create my code to use that. So I'll save this. This one, let's say we'll use a global content for this. So create a shared content folder, and we'll create a content folder for profiles. So now instead of using that assets folder, I'll come back down here to my profile rendering. I copied that GUID in for that folder that's going to be a shared folder. And come down here to my data source location and paste that in. So now it's going to look for that, it's going to look in that folder instead of in the local assets folder. And my template, I set that, jump here under templates, down under sites, ignition, components, profile, and we're specifying that it uses a profile. We're not going to have any parameters templates or anything like that, so we can just save it. There's one more very, very important thing to remember is you always want to choose an icon. Most important part, most fun part of working in Sitecore.
The edition should come with its own icon tag.
I was actually thinking about doing that. It's like seriously.
I was being less serious, like funny.
No.
Oh, well, yeah, humorous one or something.
Yeah. We're having those.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We need to have one.
We need to add like a car horn and stuff like that as well.
So we'll say that because all of
like
our
food category,
all of our people are heroes, or champions. We'll use a trophy for our profile. And then, obviously, if you needed to do standard values or something like that, you could do your standard values here just to have them. And save. So I know then that I'm going to need this ID for this item very early on. So I'm going to copy this. So now we're done in Sitecore. That's all the Sitecore work there is to create a rendering. Come back here into code. I'm going to jump into my project here. Under Ignition, I'm going to add a folder called Profile. And under here, I'm going to add we're making an interface because we'll declare the model for this first. So it'll be iProfile. And decorate it. And one thing I actually have, but they're not working quite right, is maybe I'll do it that way here. Oops, no, not that. is there are ignition templates for like an ignition model. And I'll just call it profile 2 or whatever. So there's a few things that are messed up with it, but actually, no, most of it's here. So it actually puts the site core type and all that stuff in here. So if I delete profile 1 and rename this to profile 2 to profile 1, oh, it'd be iProfile, that's why. That's it. So now here's our model. So we don't need the model base because our other things inherit model base. So what do we say? We had heading. So an I heading, an I subtitle. We had a I background image, an I image, and we'll just put the link in here and leave it at that for now. I primary link. And that's our model. So now we don't need that anymore. We can close that. So now I usually from here, I'll work backwards. So I'll create my view model next. And we're just going to assume that this would have one particular view. So I'm just going to go to code, create a class, and call this profile view model, and it inherits the base view model. And for now, that's it. I know I'm going to have, so at this point, I know it's got to have an I heading, so public I heading, get set, etc. I would put all the other fields in here the same way. Everything that I inherited or everything that I use in this view, I would put in here. So I heading, I rich content 1, and I primary link. Like I said, for time's sake is the only reason I'm kind of rushing through this, but and so that's really it for my view model. I mean, obviously I would finish everything out. So next, you could create your view and work from there, or you can create your agents and kind of work backwards. I'll create the view real quick. So we'll add our MVC view, call this profile, imagine that, and then we'll have, we know that our model is going to be a profile view model, and then say I jump down into my HTML and I go to portfolio and I find code for a profile, paste that in. These would probably be coming from Sitecore, so I think like this is the background image. So I would say at HTML dot render or HTML dot glass dot render image, and I forgot the dots. I don't normally code on this particular computer. Dot render image.
Yeah, sure.
Model a lambda a dots, and this is the only other thing that gets kind of weird. And of course, I didn't put the image in there. Let me do that very quickly. Come back to the view. A dots. Now, oops. So the field name is image, but it's an inherited thing. The field for iImage is image. So because the iImage back there had an image field and we implemented that, it's actually not just image, it's image.image. And this is the number one thing that trips people up. We're working on a way to fix this. Currently, this is a really small price to pay for all the flexibility, but we're hoping to make it so that we don't have to do that. But just for now, remember that it's image.image or primary link.primary link or whatever. Very small addition, but
I have kids. I'm used to repeating myself.
Exactly. A model. Whoops. Apparently I had caps lock. Model. Oops, and I got rid of the razor. Model. So now this is my heading. Heading. And so on. So now that's all I need to do for my views. If I want to make, so right now there is no Experience Editor view in here, but if I copy this, rename it, and rename this with a .ee, and I open this one will automatically get displayed if you're in Experience Editor mode. If it doesn't exist, it doesn't show it, and it'll show the other one. So you don't have to create these for every single Experience Editor or every single component, just where it makes sense. I mean, where you really think you might need to give your content authors some guidance, or if you know that this is a slider or a carousel and I don't want to display all these images and have them have to like try to get to where the one they want is stopping, whatever, you can just display these in a different way that's more Experience Editor friendly then. And this, once again, all happens under the hood. So you code it, the framework will adjust for it automatically. And as long as it's in the same folder as your other view.
So would you say it's the best practice to always do this?
I won't say always. I mean, if it's one of those things where it can be nice, because like if you look at what I did with the call to action, it's kind of a minor difference between like main.cshtml and main.ee.cshtml. And I'm using this site notation in this particular site as kind of the marker of this is Experience Editor stuff, because site isn't commonly used. Yeah, I mean, it really is. It's how complex your view is. For something like this, it may be kind of nice just to throw some instructions. If people are going to be working in Experience Editor and Content Editor, it's probably a good idea to do these views, because you can say, hey, this maps to this field in Sitecore, whereas if they're working exclusively in the Experience Editor, it doesn't matter what the name is.
Right.
Because they're not going to be interacting.
What about the glass editable stuff? Like, does that edit
you can do
any
that
amount of overhead?
Not anything that's really measurable. I mean, there's going to be a teeny tiny, but not.
But who cares? So it's not worth.
It's not appreciable
for that.
But of course, you're going to have to update this in both places if markup changes.
If markup changes, yeah. But most times, if markup changes, the important thing to update is going to be the presentation
for a person to try and click on to try and edit.
More so than the Experience Editor. I mean, really, your Experience Editor view should almost be just like plain
same with slides, right? You know, you don't want the slider moving.
Kind of different.
You can do that with this.
Exactly. So it's kind of a judgment thing, in short.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I'm working on a component, I always only want to have one view as possible. But like, if I see myself doing like an if,
is that built?
Is it Sitecore.context.page.experience editor, you know, and having a bunch of branching logic in my view.
Yeah.
I'll just go ahead and get it out.
For loading of JavaScript modules.
For those that couldn't hear, what Corey was saying was if he finds himself making a lot of logic in his view, that's like to check if you're an Experience Editor about whether or not to display something. Just make an Experience Editor view. So it's kind of it's at your discretion whether you think it's needed. Not everyone is required.
Yeah, I have a good example of that too.
Scott.
it's really going to be hard for the people on the phone to hear.
No, the other use case we had at Anthem is the complex use. Let's say we have an accordion of it, and we are not coding JavaScript. Like we are saying in terms of view, so you can put
Right.
code represented, you can monitor that to make it
Yeah.
easy to-
So if you could or couldn't hear Raja, what he was saying was that there might be scenarios where you would disable JavaScript in a view so that the editors could work with it and that kind of thing. So once again, if you think it's appropriate, then make them.
Okay. I was going to say I had a good example of that where for a component I was using Google Maps and I certainly didn't want that turned on in the experience editor.
Right.
So I created a separate view where that whole JavaScript functionality was turned off.
Correct. Yeah, that's a prime example. So moving on, because we don't have a ton of time. So that's basically how our views are going to work. So now I'm going to create an agent for the view model. So I'm just going to come in here and create an agent. And the names that I'm using, you'll kind of see a theme. It's always going to be the component name and then whatever appropriate suffix. So this is an agent. So this is going to be a profile agent. And also one thing that we got rid of that was in is there's no longer a difference between a JSON agent and a view agent or anything like that. It's all one agent now. Agent, and then you need to specify the view model type that your agent's going to use. So I know I have a profile view model. And then it's going to say that I need to implement the missing members, which ReSharper will happily do for me. And so now in this particular case, I probably could have gotten away without using an agent. I'm going to make one here, but I'll show you how to do it both ways. So populate model, say, for example, in the view model, I put an additional field in here that's a comment. So this profile agent, just for the heck of it, for something different, might say view model dot comment is equal to ignition rocks. So this is, I mean, it's a really simple example of when you might use an agent, is if you need to pass additional data in that's not going to be automatically bound. You'll find this a lot more, especially if you're using more complex data types. So like if you're using a structured data template where it's not going to have all these inherited fields, you'd need an agent for all of those. And then your agent's done. So this is how quick and easy all this stuff is. Finally then, I'm going to need a controller. So I'm going to create a profile controller. It's going to inherit from base controller. Once again, implement the missing methods. Clean up some white space. And now, so I know my action. Once again, this is profile controller, which is what I declared in Sitecore. My public action results is going to be named profile, like I said in Sitecore, and it might be complaining that it's the same name as the. Oh no, never mind. Is that okay? Does it like that? Oh, now it's all code. Pass don't return a value. So now all that I have to do is return. And actually, I can do this. I'll do this like you would expect to see, but you can make it even smaller. Return get view results and the agent type, which is profile agent, comma, the view model type, which is profile view model. And my component is done. It probably doesn't like this because the action name is profile. I'll call it profile 2. Yeah, that's what it was. So you probably don't, in Sitecore, I would have named this like display profile or something like that, just so they weren't exactly the same. And now this will automatically make your agent, execute your code. So that's what I didn't really explain too. This populate model, this is called for every single controller. This is where all of your logic will start from, is in this populate model. So this is always going to be where this stuff comes from. Yeah. So now you don't even have to specify the view name because, granted, this view name was profile. I'll just put this back so it's right. This is it's gonna instantiate your agent and your view model, and then it's gonna load profile.cshtml, or if you're an experience editor, it will load profile.ee.cshtml. And you're done. Now in this case, we didn't we added something in here just to show you how this works. We have another mechanic to where if we didn't want to use an agent, you can just use the view model. If all of your fields are doing nothing but mapping auto-bound fields, like the ignition fields, that's all you need to do. You don't need to even create an agent. So I could delete profile agent here, and the code would still work. It's not going to populate that comment field, but we wouldn't really have the comment field for something like that. So, and this is it. So in a matter of 20 minutes, we've created a component. I haven't loaded it up in the experience editor. I mean, there's all the other little stuff with that. My experience editor in this particular Sitecore instance is having a few issues with the layout, so I'm not going to go into that. But that's it. This is all the coding that's involved. Now you're still going to want to do your due diligence if you're using an agent or something like that to make sure that you're checking, validating your data or making sure you have the right thing. There is going to be some more custom validation for your models built into the framework. It's not there quite yet, but it's close. But yeah, I mean, it's that simple. 4 to 5 files or 5 to 6 total files. You know that for this profile, everything is going to be associated in this profile folder. You know what files you need to create, and that's that. Now, say we were creating this was just a highlight profile. We might also create a detail. So, apparently I hit caps lock at some point. Anybody that's ever chatted with me knows that I hit caps lock a lot.
I just thought you were yelling at me.
Well, I am.
Okay.
Public action results, we'll call it detail profile. And I would do this exact same thing. Return get view results. And now I would need to have a profile or a detail profile view, but it would automatically route to detail profile because the name of the method is detail profile. So once again, that quickly just wired up an additional view that you can just then get your HTML and start dropping your stuff in. And then in Sitecore, you would say, okay, this is the profile as the controller name and detail profile as your action. So any questions or thoughts or comments or concerns or anything? I know, like I said, I ran through this pretty quickly, and this is being recorded, so you can go back and watch this stuff again. Me, Corey, George, Chris, Scott, I mean, Scott hasn't worked with it as much, but he's familiar with it. Anybody that's worked with the framework, Bill Casey has worked with this extensively. Alan's worked with this extensively. The guys that have worked on proficient.com have used a little bit older version of it. But any questions, thoughts, concerns?
It seems too good to be true. Does it work?
Yes, Rajana says it seems too good to be true. Does it work? And the answer is yes.
So there's only three easy payments at $59.99.
It's in production on one site right now. Right?
It's on proficient.com right now. Itron is about ready to kick off with it. AmFam used a version of it or a variation of it.
So the idea is when you start a new project, is this going to be like a NuGet package?
It'll actually be, we'll clone the whole solution, and then you can just start dropping your stuff right into it. If you're using this to create a module, because there's also, it's fully, if I have a sitemap project, say I open up, I don't know what I just did. Let's say I open up another copy of Visual Studio here.
I don't know how you see that icon.
I'm straining. It's bigger on my screen at home. Here, just click that.
The resolution is so great. See that dot right there? That's the icon.
Yeah. Well, the laptop that I'm on has high resolution. My screen at home is actually 4K, so I've got this. I had a sitemap module. Let's see.
How feasible is it to drop it into an existing project?
Actually, it shouldn't be too bad. We are going to have a NuGet project for ignition.core and ignition.data, so you can just start referencing it in a new one. To retrofit your old stuff would probably take some work, but if you wanted to start using it for future stuff, it would be a lot easier. So as far as this, this is a module that can work completely with the framework, and there'll be a NuGet package that has a reference to your core stuff. So this would be things you just build and deploy into Sitecore and then generate a package for it, and you're good to go. So, I mean, this is completely extensible in that way as well. You can create modules that you can just drop right in with Sitecore. We've got some conventions that we use for where to put these things and how to script them up and configure them and all that. But it is completely extensible as far as that goes, too. And then, like I said, this will be open source at the end of this week. So, I mean, we're hoping to get a lot of community buy-in. We're already trying to generate some buzz. Chris has been doing a great job at kind of leading that stuff and getting people interested and talking to a lot of companies that like e-commerce and the Active Commerce and things like that. We're really gonna be getting some people behind it. Hopefully, we get to talk about it at Symposium. We'll see what happens.
I have the most important question. Do we have a logo?
We do.
And are there T-shirts?
We do.
No,
There are not T-shirts yet.
There are stickers,
We
though.
do, however, have a
I
logo.
want to see the logo.
Thanks to this guy right here.
Yeah, thanks to Mr. Bauer.
Yeah.
Can we get rid of that image.image thing? You had me until that.
Like I said,
Image and then hit right
It just seems really redundant.
You guys aren't seeing this, but I'm throwing something at Alan here. All right, let me get the.
Preaching to the
I
choir.
think I have it in Slack here. I have to see this ridiculously small thing.
A good
I think
enhancement
it's
is always when
3 pixels to
you
the
know,
right.
Oh,
you
actually,
create your
no,
view
I
model
don't
by
have it
just
in
going
here.
new, and then you create your view.
Hopefully my desktop
It'd be
is
nice if you
safe.
could have the template that would go off to the Sitecore item because it knows what it is, and grab what it's based on and create those 4 methods
Here
for
it
it.
is.
Yeah, I was playing with it a little bit actually just now while.
So this is the ignition logo.
Because that would be cool. Because
Oh, I like it.
if you have a bunch of them inherited, just
Doesn't have a cursor on the
boom,
left
right,
side.
create it, and they're already there, and you only have to add any custom ones.
Yeah.
Very cool.
That's the plan.
So yeah, and there's currently sitecoreignition.com. We have sitecoreignition.com. Demo.sitecoreignition.com right now actually points to the demo site that I've been working on.
Where's the close for the time?
I don't know.
Oh, it's a marketer. I
It
mean,
might be the solution for that dot thing.
yeah.
We'll get
So
the close once again.
I know. I tried it with it. It didn't look.
Yeah.
That's from marketing one. Sorry.
so yeah, any questions or thoughts or concerns or hallelujahs or anything like that? Any feedback?
It's all right.
Yeah, with the logo, is that a match or a candle?
Is it what?
Match or a candle?
Whatever you want it to be.
It's an ignition.
Whatever lights, yeah.
That's a pilot light.
It's
Pilot light. I
it's a
like
stick
that.
of dynamite.
Yeah, it's a pilot light and it's a power, like an Xbox.